So thank you, John, for joining us today.
Hi.
Hello. My first kind of provocation is that you hear the statement, intensive farming is the only way we're going to feed the world. How would you respond?
It's one of those statements that's sort of been flying around for the last 20 years that I know of, and on every occasion it's come from agribusiness. I very rarely heard that come from policymakers, from the FAO, or people who are genuinely looking at the wider picture of what we want from food and farming over the next 20, 50 years, that sort of thing. And I think we've got to understand, it's really important to understand where that statement is coming from. It's coming from an industry that's made all its profits from inputs into farming, from sprays, from fertilizer and that sort of thing. And so what they're trying to do, I think, is take ownership of the actual metrics by which we measure success. And it has all been about out and out production, because for the, since the 1950s, 1960s, that is what that particular intensive form of farming has delivered, its output. I think as we've moved on, and certainly since the 2000s, particularly when I've probably been a little bit more involved in policy and developing these sort of transitional models of farming, what we know we have got to deliver from farming is actually a far more balanced approach. There's a lot more outcomes. We've got to be, yes, there's production. We've got to feed people. And that even just that little bit, just that feeding people isn't just about volumes of output. It is actually what we're producing. If we're using that output to produce cattle feed, and that is going into beef production, which is then feeding people, within that food chain, there's an inherent sort of anywhere between 1 to 7 to 1 to 13% inefficiency in terms of input to the actual nutrition that humans get from it. So it's wrong just to look at actually so many tons per acre or so many tons per hectare of wheat or field beans or oilseed rape. If we're talking more about nourishing people, then we need to look actually at what that output is in terms of human diet. And that's just one part of it. We know we need to be looking at the environment. We need to be looking at soil health. And I know I've shared with you, there's a small piece of work that we're doing, which is trying to bring together all these various different outcomes for farming. Oh, brilliant, that's it. So we're looking at things at the top. Towards the top, we've got nutrition, but we've also got biodiversity. And we know that 50 years of intensive farming has really hammered biodiversity. We're looking at soil health, and there again, just driving around the countryside, we don't need a lot of research to tell us that soils are in a dreadful place. We're seeing a lot of erosion. That's ending up in rivers, silting up rivers. We're getting flooding problems for it. And these are soils that are taking hundreds of years to get to the state they are, and it's going to take a long while to rebuild. There's erosion of natural capital, and this is certainly in terms of natural resources, something that intensive farming hasn't got a good track record on. If you look at the way we're mining phosphorus around the world, pollution, nitrous oxide emissions, that sort of thing. These are all huge issues that we've got to tackle. So at the bottom left-hand corner, this is the model, the intensive model, the one we keep hearing about, feeding the world, which is actually a proxy argument for just looking at output. It's a very thin model. And I would argue, even in terms of nutrition, that the relationship between farming output and nutrition isn't that great. The next model, the way that the dialogue has moved over the last 10 years, is to sort of say, well, sustainable intensification, that's the buzzword. And the idea is you still have that existing model of intensive farming, but you bolt onto it areas which are dedicated for environmental benefits. And then when you start looking at that complete area, the area for production, and coupled with the area of that's set aside for environment, the actual production per acre over that whole field, the whole farm, if you like, starts to come down quite a bit. And the difference between that and something, let's say, very low input farming, organic farming, that sort of thing, isn't that great. And what we are trying to bring into this is actually some further factors, looking at things like the social benefits from farming, you know, care farming, it's involving people, giving them jobs, that sort of thing. The energy balance, and there again, intensive farming, the energy balance is not great at all. We're trying to bring all those together. I mean, it's a huge piece of work, and we've got, I would say, 50% of the way there. But even this initial sort of model, it shows that the mixed farming, and that's not organic, this is just mixed farming, in terms of filling the national requirement, which is the inner circle, that is actually a far more powerful model. And I think, you know, even on the scale of an allotment or something like that, people have an understanding that you're growing what people need. There are the wraparound benefits in terms of wildlife. People can see what, you know, how soils are benefiting. And there's no difference in principle between whether it's an allotment scale or 5,000 acres. The principles are exactly the same. And we've got to get away from, I think it's a distraction, some things like, you know, it's not going to feed the world. Actually, feeding the world is about far more things like waste, access to food, whether what we're producing is what people want to eat. And if you look at sort of India, Africa, a lot of subsistence farming has been displaced for commodity cropping. You know, so these are, they're actually quite complex questions. And it's, I think, as I say, it's a mistake to get distracted on, you know, on that. I think we've got to be actually far more focused on what we think we want to do, which is, I would argue, more towards this mixed rotational farming model that delivers all the, you know, all the different outcomes that we're now expecting from food and farming. So thank you for sharing that.
A pleasure.
That's it. That's a long, sorry, it's a very long and convoluted thing, but you're quite right to pick it up, I think, as the first point, because it's not only a distraction, but it is a way of, I think there's a real danger that there's such a value in urban farming, you know, all these initiatives coming forward, and it's so easy just to dismiss them and saying, oh, well, it's not going to feed the world. It gets me a little bit cross, because there is a huge value in these things, and I think we've got to stay true to those, you know, to that belief that this is actually the way forward.
And so the next question, and maybe we could pick up on that word value again. Could you tell us the main differences between mainstream, intensive or conventional farming and alternative approaches?
I guess, yeah, I guess this is a sort of question of semantics. I haven't met a single farmer at the moment who would describe himself as intensive, you know, but I would, my way of defining it is actually in terms of inputs. If the default position is a farm as a closed system where you are building all the fertility from within the farm, you're not relying on external inputs for either, you know, in terms of energy, in terms of nutrients for crops and that sort of thing. There's a completely closed system. I would say that that is the ideal model, because you're not depleting any natural resources. It is how I would define sustainable. And it's that model, coming back to that model of subsistence farming. It is the, you know, it's actually an incredibly resilient model. And that's a word which I don't think we always hear often enough. But if there is one lesson from the last 10 years, it's we have got to build a lot more resilience into farming. So intensive is one that I would define as being very reliant on external inputs, whether that's for weed, pest control, nutrition, that sort of thing. If you're hugely reliant on that coming from mainstream, unfortunately, economics shapes farming, and the economic model is such that that model I've just described, the one where it's very input driven, is the one that is, you know, it is profitable at the moment. And we probably need to have a look at the externalized costs from that model and start to internalize them before we actually get a better balance. The alternative approaches is one, you know, it comes back to what I feel are the strengths of rotational farming, mixed farming, that sort of thing, where there's a lot of value in that that's not recognized at the moment. The financial model isn't so great. The margins are certainly very, very tight on it. But if we're looking to the future of farming, I think it's one we've got to invest in.
Thank you. Could you now tell us a little about the seeds that you grow and the types of grain?
Yeah, particularly in terms of the grain, it's been an interesting journey for us. We started this. We grow milling wheat, so like most farms, we grow it in terms of lorry loads. And in the very early days, what we would do from a 20 or 30 ton lot, you know, let's say we grew 100 tons, that's 3 lorry loads and there's 10 tons left over. That's how it works out. And we felt there's some value in that. It's completely uneconomic to get rid of 10 tons on a lorry load because you end up paying big transport costs for it. And people don't want to be dealing in anything less than a lorry load. So we felt there was a good opportunity to try and do something with those smaller amounts, and actually the small amounts were a very good fit to sort of windmills, mills, that sort of thing. So we started working with a really inspirational mill at Tuxford, run by Paul Wyman, who we started off with just a little, you know, this bit of willing wheat, and over a period of time, we realised actually that the potential is quite significant, and so we grew more and more wheat for Paul and the mill at Tuxford, and become less focused on the lorry loads. And then a couple of years ago, we also met up through Paul with Kim at the Small Food Bakery at Nottingham, and she came up with this request and said, would you be interested in growing a population wheat? Because she'd been working with Hod Medods and the work that Martin Wolf had been carrying out at Wakelins on population. And it may be worth me just explaining what a population wheat is and what a conventional wheat. The conventional wheats we've been growing are a single variety. The particular one we had grown is called Edgar. It grows well on an organic system, and it's not your typical hybrid wheat that over successive generations will lose its vigor. It's, you know, it's quite a robust wheat. The population wheat, the concept is that if you grow a complete field of a single variety, it is actually quite susceptible to anything like a particular pathogen. If you've got one particular variety susceptible to one particular pathogen, it'll go through the whole field. And if there is a particular climatic conditions, you know, if it's been a very wet autumn or it's been particularly dry or something like that, there again, one plant susceptibility will reflect in the whole field. And Martin's approach had been, well, actually, there's a lot of strength in having a more diverse genetic makeup of the different plants. And he started with he took 20 different varieties and crossed them with another 20 different varieties. And between them, you end up with about something like 200 to 400 different crosses. And we grew this, and that was a little bit, I've got to say, it's a bit of a leap of faith for us, because we'd gone from milling wheat. We knew that by growing this population wheat, there was no other market than Kim and the artisan bakers, the artisan millers, because you can't sell as milling wheat something that's a population. It was done very much as a on a sort of a temporary license, if you like, between Martin Wolf as the developer and Paul and Kim as both the millers and the bakers. But I mean, we were blown away with it. We put one field into it and we had very low expectations. and it performed incredibly well. And I think that was the real start of our journey. And from there, it encouraged us to sort of reassess what it is that we want from wheats, and to look again at actually some of the less developed wheats that, you know, it's very easy to write them off, particularly the heritage ones, landrace wheats we think of as being underdeveloped, but particularly on our system, a very low input organic system, they do incredibly well. And we've grown, so the populations are the ones with, you know, they've been bred. I think the YQ that we had about 108, between 180 and 200 different crosses in it. And since then we've been working with Ed Dickin, who is based up near Lincoln at Oak Farm, and he's on his third different interpretation of his own population wheats, and they have taken the whole population to another level. They've done incredibly well. We grow a landrace, and landrace are the sort of pre-developed wheats. The particular one that we've been growing is a Scandinavian one called Ölands, which originated on the Swedish island of Öland. It's a spring wheat. It's fantastic. It does incredibly well. The last couple of years we've grown it. It's 14% protein. The flavour is just phenomenal, and it's taken us in a direction, I said about a leap of faith, but it's taken us from a point where we were focused on filling lorry loads to one where we are far more interested now in things like flavour, how it can be used for baking, not just bread making, but biscuits, to pastries, all that sort of thing. And it's been a real journey of discovery for somebody who, towards the sort of mid-50s, thought they knew all there was about wheat farming. It was just like starting again, just learning about what we're growing and seeing what millers and bakers can do with it. It's just phenomenal.
Brilliant, thank you. The next question, can you tell us a bit about what experimentation and innovation mean to you?
I think there's a thing, most farmers you'll speak to sort of talk about legacy, what it is they want to leave behind when they finish their farming career, and most will say that they want to leave the farm in a better place than when they took it on. It's not always possible for a number of reasons, but I think for us it's slightly different. My feeling is that in some little way, and it really is a very tiny little way, but I'd like to feel that we leave farming as such in a better place than it is now. And we can only really do that by actually doing the hard work of seeing what is and isn't possible. Experimentation, the trouble is that I think we are quite risk averse in terms of farming. Usually the financial risk is quite significant. But I think that the risk of doing nothing is actually quite significant. We really do have some serious problems in terms of soil health. As I say, farming is shaped by economics, and we've got to somehow change the economic model. We've got to change the relationship we have with customers, processors. We've got to see things very much as a collective responsibility for the whole food chain, rather than just individual elements that are being quite often pitted against each other. A lot of these are very, very big things, but I think the way that you start to join up and make this all happen is by each individual part of that chain taking responsibility and saying, look, I can't change it all, but I can actually change the bit that I'm working with. And in terms of us taking a fresh look at what we grow and the way we work with other people, I think that's probably the most innovative part of what we're now doing. We've sat down in about July, August time and worked out with the millers, with the bakers, what it was that we're going to grow this autumn collectively in terms of varieties and what we could do with it. But that was a shared decision, and that will actually define what is harvested in the summer 2021 and will be our seed stocks right through to summer 2022. So it's it's a far more, it's a long-term planning, but it is a collaborative one. And for me, that is what experimentation, innovation is all about. It's working with other people, and when things don't work out, the risk is diminished because it's a collective learning lesson. When you share, we share successes with other people within the UK Grain Lab group, with other growers. We share successes, but we also share, the ones that are less successful, and we learn from them.
Brilliant. So there's some crossover. The next question is, what does risk mean to you as a farmer?
Yeah, the risk is mostly a financial one. Funny enough, when we talk to a lot of farmers, there's a lot of people in the conventional world, in other words, those who are not organic, and they have a sort of more mainstream model of farming, do worry about stepping outside of that, because if you have failure, it's not just a financial failure, it's also having the guys next door looking over the field hedges and sort of effectively saying, I told you it wasn't going to work, or something like that. So there's actually quite a lot of peer pressure in farming, and that shouldn't be underestimated. To some extent, we've already been through that journey when we went organic, because we are in a little bit of an oasis here. I think we've probably got to go 20-30 miles around here before we find the next organic farm. And the expectation was, at an early stage, I think everybody felt that our farming was going to go down the pan, and it didn't go down the pan, which was something we were quite pleased about. But to some extent, that side of the element of risk is we're not so worried about, but there is still a financial element of risk. And I think the reason that we've been able to take the risks we have is, as a business, we're a little bit, we are quite diversified. My background's in engineering. I still do some engineering work. My brother's background, he does a lot of groundworks and that sort of thing. And although a lot of advisors say we shouldn't do it, we actually use those as a buffer for some of the risks we take with the farming, so that if we do have something that either doesn't work, or we know that in order to get from where we are to where we need to be, there is going to be a shortfall in income, we actually use those, we use the engineering, we use the groundworks to cross-subsidise into the farming. And we've got one at the moment where we've to reflect this change in focus towards mills and artisan grains and that sort of thing. We've just invested in a granary, which takes us up to food grade standards for everything that we're producing out the farm. I mean, it's been a terrific investment, and if you just sat down and looked at it on the paper, you'd say, well, it doesn't stack up. We are not a big farm. We are 300 acres now, and there's no way that we would recoup that even over the next 25 years. But if we don't do anything, we're never going to move from where we are. So we try to mitigate the risk as far as we can, but it's because we are incredibly determined on trying to get to where we're going to get to. And I think that is the key to it. It's always a balance between risk and ambition, and sometimes you have got to take the risks to to move from where you are to the place you want to be.
And the next question is, what does success and failure mean to you as a farmer?
Yeah, it reminds me of the poem. Both of them are success and failure. Both. Can you remember? If it'll come to me, and I'm sure everybody out there is screaming what the actual answer is, but they're imposters anyway. Both imposters. I think how you define success and failure is an important one. I don't, even at the point we finally pack up and give up retiring, I don't think there's ever a point in which I could say we've been entirely successful. and equally there's never been entirely failure. There's always something to learn. It's a learning process, and I think, you know, if I had a definition of failure, it would be just to stand still and let, you know, just feel that the you know, the future of pharma being mapped out by sort of agribusiness is an inevitable endpoint. That would be our my definition of failure. I think success is anything else that takes us along a different path, a more resilient path.
And lastly, why do you do what you do?
Yeah, I have to keep asking myself that every so often, particularly when things aren't going quite so well. But I suppose we're doing, you know, we are doing what we're doing for the next generation, and that's not just my generation. You know, we over the last 20 or so years have been really fortunate to work with some really nice groups of people. I'm sure a lot of people know sort of the Oxford Real Farming Conference. I was involved in that in the very early days. And that's just one example, you know, Groundswell. There's so many initiatives out there, and you just go along to those and you see all this, you know, terrific enthusiasm for food and farming, particularly from people outside, you know, food and farming, and they can bring so much to it. You know, I genuinely believe that. I think part of the problem is people who've been farming for a long while, you do get very stuck in a rut. And it's the people who are coming from outside farming, taking a fresh look at it, asking them, you know, what it is that we want, understanding the changes in society, you know, the way our relationship with animals, that's the big one that we are grappling with at the moment. And, you know, it comes back to this, what we see as sort of success and that sort of thing. Why we do what we do is because I think we do have to change. And I think that there are people at, you know, various points in the food chain, bringing food to people, being involved in food and farming, and all the wraparound things, the social care, the you know, the environmental aspects of things. They all come together. They've all got a part to play, and I'd like to feel that, you know, that it, as I say, that point where we give, you know, finally sort of put our boots up, we can look back and say, well, we did our bit, and yeah, hopefully it's helped move things forward a little bit.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, John. That was really very interesting and very inspiring.
It's been lovely, and, you know, congratulations on everything that the Sheffield Wheat Experiment's doing. I mean, I think it's a wonderful initiative. Urban agriculture has been something I've, you know, for 10, 15 years been following. There's some fantastic examples out there, and you know, it comes back to feeding people and that sort of thing. And it has to start at that very small level. If it works at the small level, it can work at the big level. Ironically, it doesn't work the other way around. You know, what stuff at the big level doesn't always work at a human level. And I think if we can find a return to human scale farming and think about not feeding people so much as nourishing communities, if that can start to be, you know, what we're trying to achieve, to nourish communities, and I mean by nourishing in every sense of the word, that is a terrific thing. And it will start with things like the Sheffield Wheat Experiment.
You've given us the strap line for the whole project.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Okay.